In April 1978, the quiet city of Coral Gables, Florida, was shattered by a single gunshot that would echo for more than 3 decades. Officer Luis Pena, a 41-year-old father, husband, and decorated police officer, was just doing his job, pulling over a driver who had run a red light. But what began as a routine traffic stop would become one of the most haunting cases in Florida's criminal history. Behind the wheel of that car was Manuel Valle, a 27-year-old Cuban immigrant with a troubled past. Moments after Officer Pena returned his patrol car to check the license plate, Valle walked back to his vehicle, reached inside, and pulled out a gun. Without warning, he opened fire, striking Officer Pena in the neck, killing him instantly. When a backup officer arrived, Valle shot again, hitting him in the back. The second officer survived only because of his bulletproof vest. Valle fled the scene, sparking a massive manhunt across Miami-Dade County. 2 days later, police caught up with him. He confessed, but claimed it was all a mistake, a moment of panic he could never take back. The murder of Officer Luis Pena shook the community and outraged the nation. And what followed would span 33 years. A relentless legal battle over justice, morality, and the meaning of time on death row. Manuel Valle would fight his conviction all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and even the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He became one of the longest-serving inmates on Florida's death row, aging from a young man to a gray-haired prisoner awaiting his fate. And when his day finally came, September 28, 2011, Valle's execution would be marked by controversy once more. He was the first person in Florida to be executed using a new drug, pentobarbital, a chemical so untested that even his lawyers warned it might cause unbearable pain. For his final meal, Valle ordered fried chicken breast, white rice, garlic toast, peach cobbler, and a Coca-Cola. And when asked for his final words, he simply said, "No, I don't." It had taken 33 years, countless appeals, and one long walk to the death chamber for justice to be carried out. But even then, the questions lingered. Was it justice or vengeance delayed? To understand how a single gunshot changed 2 families, tested the system, and reignited a debate over the death penalty that still divides America, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of how time, justice, and mercy collided on death row. Manuel Valle's story begins far from the streets of Coral Gables, Florida. He was born on May 21st, 1950, in Havana, Cuba, in a nation torn by revolution and political upheaval. Like many families fleeing Fidel Castro's regime, the Valle family sought refuge and opportunity in the United States. They arrived in Florida during the early 1960s, part of the great Cuban exile wave that reshaped Miami's culture and community. But for young Manuel, the promise of the American dream would soon slip away. He grew up amid hardship, a foreign country, a new language, and a struggle to fit in. By his teenage years, Valle was already in trouble. Minor thefts, fights, and run-ins with local police marked his early record. What began as petty crimes slowly escalated into more serious offenses: car thefts, break-ins, and possession of stolen property. As the 1970s unfolded, Valle's life spiraled deeper into crime. Friends and acquaintances later described him as aimless, impulsive, and often under the influence of drugs. He drifted between low-paying jobs, never staying in one place long. His rap sheet grew, and so did his reputation among law enforcement. By his late 20s, Valle was living on the margins, broke, restless, and reckless. He had been arrested multiple times and was known to drive stolen vehicles around South Florida. Those who knew him said he carried himself with quiet defiance, a man hardened by years of struggle and disappointment. In early 1978, Valle was unemployed once again and staying in the Miami area. He had recently acquired a stolen 1974 Camaro, a car that would soon become central to one of the most infamous murders in Florida's history. On April 2nd, 1978, that Camaro rolled through a red light in Coral Gables. Behind the wheel sat a man who had lost nearly everything: direction, family, and faith, and who, in a matter of seconds, would make a choice that would define the rest of his life. The man who once dreamed of freedom in America would soon become a name synonymous with tragedy, remorse, and controversy. Manuel Valle, the convict who would spend more than 3 decades on death row. Officer Luis Pena was the embodiment of duty, compassion, and quiet strength. Born and raised in South Florida, he dedicated his life to protecting the people of Coral Gables, a close-knit community where he was known not just as an officer, but as a friend and neighbor. At 41 years old, Luis was a devoted husband and the proud father of 2 young children who adored him. His colleagues described him as a man who led by example, firm but fair, patient in the face of conflict, and always the first to volunteer when a situation demanded courage. Luis joined the Coral Gables Police Department in the late 1960s, quickly earning the respect of his peers for his professionalism and calm presence under pressure. Over the years, he built a reputation as a reliable and honorable officer, someone who could defuse tense moments with empathy rather than aggression. He had received commendations for his service and was considered one of the department's most trusted veterans. But beyond the badge, he was a family man, a father who coached Little League on weekends, a husband who made it home in time for dinner whenever he could, and a man who believed deeply in community. His wife later recalled how he would come home, remove his uniform, and talk about wanting to make the streets safer for the next generation. On the morning of April 2nd, 1978, Luis began his shift like any other: routine patrols, traffic stops, and community calls. The Florida sun was bright that day, the streets calm. No one could have imagined that within hours, his name would become forever etched into the city's history. As he stopped a Camaro that had run a red light, Officer Pena was simply doing his job, enforcing the law, unaware that the driver he had just pulled over was a man on a downward spiral, one whose split-second act of violence would destroy multiple lives. In that tragic moment, the Coral Gables Police Department lost more than an officer. They lost a brother. His family lost a husband and father. And the city lost a hero whose calm professionalism and unwavering dedication to duty would be remembered for generations. Today, more than 4 decades later, Officer Luis Pena's badge still hangs in the halls of the Coral Gables Police Department, a silent reminder of his sacrifice, and of the day when a routine stop turned into an irreversible tragedy. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon on April 2nd, 1978, when Coral Gables Police Officer Luis Pena noticed a dark-colored Camaro speeding through a red light near Lejeune Road. It was a simple traffic violation, one of dozens he handled every week. But what Officer Pena didn't know was that the car had been reported stolen just days earlier, and the man behind the wheel, Manuel Valle, was no ordinary driver. He was a career petty criminal, restless, volatile, and desperate to avoid another arrest. Officer Pena activated his patrol lights and signaled for the Camaro to pull over. The vehicle slowed and came to a stop near a quiet residential street. Pena approached the driver's side window, calm and professional, unaware of the danger that waited only inches away. Valle handed over his license and registration, both fake. Everything seemed routine. But as Pena returned to his patrol car to verify the plates, Valle's mind raced. He knew the car was stolen. He knew that another arrest could send him back to prison. Panic took over reason. Without a word, Valle reached under the seat of the Camaro and pulled out a .45 caliber handgun. The Florida air was still. Officer Pena sat in his patrol car, his pen scratching across a citation pad, when Valle stepped out of his vehicle. In a moment of cold calculation and fear, he walked toward the patrol car, raised the gun, and fired. The shot rang out through the quiet Coral Gables neighborhood, a single bullet tearing through the afternoon calm. It struck Officer Pena in the neck, severing his artery. He fell instantly beside his car, mortally wounded. His service weapon never left its holster. A nearby resident called 911 as another patrol car sped toward the scene. Within moments, Officer Gary Spell, a fellow Coral Gables officer, arrived as backup. As he stepped from his cruiser, Valle turned and opened fire again. The bullet slammed into Spell's back, but his bulletproof vest stopped it, saving his life by mere inches. Valle, realizing he had just shot 2 police officers, fled in the stolen Camaro, leaving behind chaos, blood, and sirens. Officer Spell radioed for help, his voice shaking but alive as residents rushed to the scene. Officer Pena lay on the ground beside his patrol car, his badge glinting in the sunlight, his body motionless. By the time additional officers arrived, Valle was gone, speeding toward the city limits, a fugitive now wanted for murdering a police officer. That single, senseless act of violence turned a quiet Coral Gables neighborhood into a crime scene that would haunt Florida for decades to come. The manhunt for Manuel Valle had begun. For 48 tense hours, South Florida was on edge. Roadblocks went up across Dade County. Helicopters hovered above the palm-lined streets of Coral Gables. Officers combed through alleys, motels, and industrial yards, searching for the man accused of gunning down one of their own. The name on every radio frequency was the same, Manuel Valle. On April 4th, 1978, their search came to an end. Acting on a tip, officers surrounded a small apartment on Lejeune Road. Inside, they found Valle hiding under a pile of clothes in a bedroom closet. When the door swung open, he didn't resist. His hands trembled as police cuffed him, dragging him into the daylight as reporters shouted questions from the sidewalk. His arrest marked the end of a desperate manhunt and the beginning of a legal saga that would span more than 3 decades. Back at the Coral Gables Police Department, Valle was booked, fingerprinted, and led into a small gray interrogation room. Under the hum of fluorescent lights, detectives read him his rights and began to question him about the events of that Sunday afternoon. At first, Valle denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, ballistic reports, eyewitness accounts, and the discovery of the murder weapon, his story began to change. After hours of questioning, Valle finally broke. He admitted to firing the gun that killed Officer Luis Pena, but claimed it wasn't murder, that it was panic. He said he never meant to kill anyone, that he just wanted to get away. His voice cracked as he told detectives, "It just happened so fast. I got scared." But to the officers listening, there was no remorse in his words, only excuses. The confession was clear. Valle had fired the fatal shot. And while he may have called it an accident, the evidence told a different story, one of deliberate, cold-blooded action. News of his arrest spread quickly across South Florida, and by that evening, every newspaper in the state carried his face beneath headlines like "Killer of Coral Gables, Officer Captured." The community's grief turned to outrage. Officer Pena's fellow officers vowed to see justice done, while residents packed courtrooms demanding accountability. To them, this wasn't just the killing of one man, it was an attack on law and order itself. Within days, the state attorney's office announced its intent to seek the death penalty, citing the brutal and unprovoked nature of the crime. Manuel Valle was transferred to the Dade County Jail, awaiting trial under tight security, as the city of Coral Gables began to mourn its fallen hero and prepare for one of Florida's most high-profile murder cases of the decade. When the trial of Manuel Valle began in late 1978, the eyes of Florida, and indeed much of the nation, turned toward the Dade County Courthouse. The crime had shocked the public, and the courtroom overflowed with citizens, journalists, and fellow officers who came to witness justice for the fallen hero, Officer Luis Pena. From a moment Valle was led into the courtroom in shackles, his demeanor drew both scrutiny and scorn. Quiet, withdrawn, sometimes smirking, as if disconnected from the gravity of what he had done. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They meticulously laid out the timeline of that April afternoon. The traffic stop, the stolen Camaro, the fatal shot to Officer Pena's neck, and the second attack on Officer Gary Spell. Ballistics experts took the stand to confirm that the bullet removed from Pena's body matched the handgun found in Valle's possession. Eyewitnesses testified to hearing the shots and seeing Valle flee the scene. And perhaps most damning of all, the jury heard Valle's own words from his taped confession, where he admitted to pulling the trigger, claiming it was an act of panic rather than intent. The defense tried to portray Valle as a man consumed by fear and poor judgment, a troubled immigrant who made a terrible mistake. They argued that he didn't set out to kill anyone, that he acted in confusion, not malice. but their arguments struggled to pierce through the mountain of evidence against him. Day after day, Officer Pena's family sat in the front row, his wife clutching a handkerchief, his children too young to fully comprehend the enormity of what was happening. Behind them, Coral Gables officers filled the benches, their uniforms a sea of blue in silent solidarity. Reporters noted the tension that filled the air, a mix of sorrow, anger, and anticipation. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberations took only a few hours. The foreman stood and read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Manuel Valle, guilty of first-degree murder." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Valle sat motionless, staring ahead, while a sob echoed from the gallery. Officer Pena's widow. In the sentencing phase, the prosecution emphasized the cold, calculated nature of the killing. A police officer shot from behind, without warning or provocation. They argued that such an act demanded the ultimate punishment. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing Valle's troubled past and history of drug abuse. But the jury was unmoved. On August 3, 1978, Judge Joseph Nesbitt delivered the sentence. His voice was steady, deliberate, and final. "It is the judgment of this court that you, Manuel Valle, be sentenced to death by electrocution." The courtroom fell silent. For many, justice had been served. For others, it marked the beginning of a long and painful chapter in Florida's death penalty history. As Valle was escorted from the courtroom, he glanced briefly at the packed gallery, a fleeting look, unreadable, before disappearing through the door leading to the county jail. Outside, demonstrators cheered the verdict, waving American flags and chanting justice for Pena. But inside the courthouse, amid the flashing cameras and hurried reporters, there was no sense of triumph. Only the heavy reality that one life had been lost forever and another was now condemned to end in the electric chair. It was, however, far from over. What followed would become one of the longest death penalty sagas in Florida's modern history. A battle of appeals, legal challenges, and shifting public opinion that would span more than 3 decades before the sentence was finally carried out. Following his 1978 death sentence, Manuel Valle's case entered a labyrinth of legal challenges that would stretch across more than 3 decades, one of the longest capital punishment sagas in Florida's modern history. What began as a straightforward conviction soon transformed into a battle between the state's resolve to carry out justice and the defense's relentless effort to save a life condemned to die. Throughout the 1980s, Valle's attorneys filed motion after motion, attacking every possible angle of his conviction, from the jury instructions to the method of execution, to the competency of his trial counsel. They argued that procedural errors had deprived Valle of a fair trial, that the death penalty was applied arbitrarily, and that his rights under the U.S. Constitution had been violated. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed his appeals several times, issuing lengthy opinions that dissected every claim. But time and again, the justices upheld the verdict, reaffirming that Valle's crime, the ambush and murder of a police officer, was among the most egregious acts under Florida law. By the early 1990s, the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Valle's defense team invoked landmark precedents like Skipper versus South Carolina and Lockett versus Ohio, arguing that mitigating factors in his life, such as his youth, history of substance abuse, and possible mental instability, had not been properly considered by the original jury. Yet, the highest court in the land denied certiorari, refusing to intervene. Each rejection carried the same terse message: petition denied. Still, Valle persisted. His lawyers shifted their strategy toward constitutional challenges, contending that the state's death penalty procedures were outdated and inconsistent with evolving standards of decency. They argued that executing a man after more than 30 years on death row constituted cruel and unusual punishment, citing the intense psychological toll of living under constant threat of death. The defense pointed to international human rights rulings, including opinions from the Privy Council and the European Court of Human Rights, where prolonged death row confinement had been deemed inhumane. In 2005, Valle's case reached beyond American borders when his attorneys submitted a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, claiming that the state of Florida had violated international law by keeping him in solitary confinement for decades under the shadow of execution. They described his existence as a cycle of hope and despair, years of waiting, only to face repeated denials. But while the commission agreed to review his case, their findings held no binding power over U.S. courts. Throughout these decades, Valle's physical transformation became symbolic of the passage of time itself. Prison photographs showed his face growing thinner, his hair turning gray, his once defiant eyes now tired and distant. Inside Florida State Prison, he became one of the state's oldest and longest-serving death row inmates, a man defined as much by the system that held him as by the crime that put him there. In the end, all the filings, hearings, and stays of execution led to the same conclusion. Despite every appeal, every motion, and every petition to both domestic and international courts, Manuel Valle's death sentence remained intact. By the late 2000s, the legal clock had run out. The courts had spoken, repeatedly and decisively. Manuel Valle would die by lethal injection in the state of Florida. His fate, sealed decades earlier, had survived every challenge. The final chapter was now in sight. As the decades passed and appeals were exhausted, the name Manuel Valle became a symbol of the long, tangled struggle between justice and the death penalty system in America. By 2011, more than 33 years had passed since the murder of Officer Luis Pena, and Valle, now 61 years old, was one of Florida's longest-serving death row inmates. But even as his execution date approached, a new and unexpected controversy arose that would once again delay the inevitable. That year, Florida's Department of Corrections announced a major change to its lethal injection protocol. The state had been forced to abandon sodium thiopental, the sedative traditionally used to render inmates unconscious before execution, after pharmaceutical companies stopped supplying it for use in capital punishment. In its place, Florida introduced a substitute, pentobarbital, a drug more commonly used for animal euthanasia and medical sedation. The switch ignited fierce debate. Defense attorneys, human rights groups, and medical experts questioned whether pentobarbital would be effective in preventing pain during execution. Valle's legal team seized on this issue, filing emergency appeals to the Florida Supreme Court and later to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that the new drug carried the risk of leaving him fully conscious as the subsequent drugs, pancuronium bromide and potassium chloride, paralyzed his lungs and stopped his heart. They claimed this would constitute cruel and unusual punishment, a direct violation of the Eighth Amendment. In lengthy filings, Valle's attorneys cited medical studies and statements from anesthesiologists who warned of the dangers of improper dosage or flawed administration. They argued that Florida had not adequately tested the drug or trained its execution teams to ensure its humane use. The state, on the other hand, countered that pentobarbital had been used successfully in other executions across the country and that the procedure was constitutional. Meanwhile, the story gripped the nation. Outside Florida State Prison, demonstrators gathered, holding vigils and chanting as television cameras rolled. Some called for clemency, pointing to Valle's decades on death row as punishment enough. Others, including law enforcement officers and the family of Officer Pena, demanded closure after 33 long years of waiting. On September 26, 2011, Valle's attorneys made a final plea to the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution, hoping to delay or halt the process altogether. The High Court reviewed the emergency application and denied it. The justices ruled that Florida's lethal injection protocol met constitutional standards and that no credible evidence suggested pentobarbital would cause undue suffering. With that ruling, the final legal barrier fell. The governor re-signed the death warrant, setting the execution for September 28, 2011. After decades of legal battles, shifting laws, and procedural delays, the case of Manuel Valle was nearing its end. The courtroom lights dimmed, the appeals were closed, and the last chapter of one of Florida's longest-running death row cases was finally about to be written. On the morning of September 28, 2011, the long road of appeals, petitions, and pleas for mercy finally came to an end. Inside a small, windowless 6 by 9-foot cell, Manuel Valle awoke to his final sunrise. At 61 years old, he was no longer the reckless young man who had pulled the trigger in 1978. His hair was gray, his face lined, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his pen to paper. That morning, Valle spent his remaining hours in silence, writing letters to his family, to his attorneys, and, according to officials, to the family of Officer Pena, though those letters were never publicly released. He was calm, guards later said. He prayed quietly for much of the morning, seated on his bunk beneath the dim glow of the ceiling light. The atmosphere inside Florida State Prison's death row wing was heavy but routine, a rhythm the staff had followed dozens of times before. Outside, a small crowd began to form by the prison gates. Anti-death penalty activists holding candles and signs, reporters setting up tripods, and a few off-duty officers standing silently in uniform. At around 4 p.m., Valle was escorted to the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. There, he was offered the traditional last meal, one final act of choice in a life stripped of all freedom. He requested fried chicken breast, white rice, garlic toast, peach cobbler, and a Coca-Cola. Witnesses described him as polite and soft-spoken, eating slowly and finishing most of the meal. He thanked the staff who brought it to him, then returned his seat to pray once more. As evening fell, the prison grew quieter. The final preparations began. Reporters were escorted into a small media viewing room. Witnesses, including members of Officer Pena's family, were led into the execution chamber gallery. A prison official entered Valle's cell shortly before 7 p.m. and asked the standard question, "Do you have any final words?" Valle looked up briefly, his voice barely audible. "No, I don't," he said. Those were his last words. At 7:05 p.m., he was strapped onto the gurney inside the execution chamber. The intravenous lines were inserted into his arms, and the curtain separating the chamber from the witnesses was drawn open. The warden gave the final order. A few moments later, the lethal injection process began. First, pentobarbital, the sedative, then pancuronium bromide, the paralytic, and finally potassium chloride, stopping the heart. Valle's chest rose and fell twice, then was still. At 7:14 p.m., Manuel Valle was pronounced dead, becoming Florida's 70th execution since 1976 and the first inmate executed in the state using the new pentobarbital protocol. Outside the prison, the crowd was divided. Some applauded, others prayed. Inside, the family of Officer Pena wept quietly, a 33-year chapter of grief and waiting finally brought to a close. For the officers of the Coral Gables Police Department, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the loss of their brother in blue would never fade. For others, it reignited old debates about the death penalty, fairness, and the meaning of justice after so much time. As night fell over Rayford, the prison lights dimmed once more, the gates closed, and the story of Manuel Valle and Officer Pena came to an irrevocable end. Two lives forever bound by one fateful moment more than 3 decades earlier. What do you think? After 33 long years of legal battles, appeals, and waiting, was justice finally served for the murder of Officer Pena? Or was the execution of Manuel Valle a haunting reminder of the complexities of capital punishment? Tell us your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We read every one of them, and your voice helps keep the conversation about truth and justice alive. If you found this story compelling, informative, or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the Crime Report Network for more in-depth, real-life crime documentaries from across the world. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we continue to uncover the darkest and most unforgettable criminal cases in history. This is Crime Report Network, where we bring you the real stories behind the crimes, the victims, the convicted, and the justice that follows. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, behind every headline, there's a human story.